Hello, I'm doing this video on the Shores of Tripoli. As you can see, I got this game for Christmas this year, along with a few others, which you'll be seeing videos on as the weeks go by. But anyway, I've had a chance to play this only solo. I've played it 2 times solo, as me playing as if I were 2 different players, and then the game also comes with a solo mode, and I played it once trying to use that solo mode. I think I didn't play some of the rules exactly right for that, but anyway, let me go over the setup and how to play, and we'll do a few example turns and I'll tell you what I think about it. Alright, first thing you'll do is set out the game map. Normally if you're playing with 2 players, one person, preferably the United States player, will sit on the northern side or that side of the map, and the Tripolitan player will sit on this side of the map. Of course, me just playing by myself as 2 players, I played 1 player over here and 1 player over here. But anyway, first thing, set up the board. Then the American player will place 3 of these frigates in the harbor of Gibraltar. The map is each of these circles like this are harbors. These lighter colored zones are patrol zones, and then of course you have the land. Alright, then the American player will place 1 frigate in 1802, 1 in 1803, and 1 in 1804. The American player will take the American or U.S. deck of cards, which has the picture of Thomas Jefferson, and they'll turn the 3 core cards. The core cards have this circle icon at the bottom, and they'll put those face up in their play area. So that's the 3 core cards. The Tripolitan player will place 2 Corsairs in the harbor of Gibraltar. They'll then place 4 Corsairs in the harbor of Tripoli. They'll place 4 infantry, that's these red squares, in Tripoli. They'll place 2 infantry in Benghazi and 2 infantry in Dern. I'm assuming that's pronounced Dern. I'm not really sure how it's pronounced, but that's how I'll be saying it. The Tripolitan player will take his deck of cards, which has this picture of Yusuf Karamanli or something like that, and he'll get his 3 core cards that have that same circle and place them in his play area face up. Yeah, Yusuf Karamanli. I don't know how to pronounce it, but there you go. If you're not playing solitaire, you'll remove the 3 solitaire cards from the game. They have this icon. Those are only in the Tripolitan player's deck, so you'll just remove those. Each player will shuffle their remaining cards and form a draw deck. The remaining ships and infantry are placed in the corresponding supply. So these Swedish ships and American infantry and Hamat's army infantry are placed in the United States supply, and these Tripolitan Corsairs and frigates and army and Tripolitan ally Corsairs are placed in the Tripolitan supply. The 12 gold coins are placed on the American side of the board, or the United States side of the board. 1 turn marker is placed on 1801, and 1 is placed on spring for the spring of 1801. As far as I noticed, the rules didn't mention anything about the dice, but I gave the red dice to the Tripolitan player, and the blue and the yellow dice to the United States player. I guess that's just assumed, I didn't see it stated to do that. And this, of course, is my ship dice tray that my daughter made for me. You may have seen that in previous videos. She made that many years ago, and that's what I use when I'm playing games with ships that require dice. So that's set up. Uh, not, not much to it. Now we'll get to how to play. Alright, so how do you play? Well, we're going to play over a series of years, starting with 1801, and each year we'll have 4 seasons. So kind of 4 rounds per year. So at the beginning of each year you have what's the start of year phase. So the first thing you do in the start of year phase is you'll take the American or U.S. player will take any frigates that are in that year and place them in the harbor of Gibraltar. So obviously in the first year, 1801, we're already starting with 3 frigates in Gibraltar, but when we move to 1802, there'll be a frigate there, possibly more than one through card play, and those will end up going into harbor of Gibraltar. So that's the first thing you do at the start of year. And if through some game effect a Tripolitan frigate is in one of these years at the start of year, then they would take their frigate and put it in the harbor of Tripoli. If it's year 1801 through 1804 in the start of year phase, each player will draw 6 cards into their hand. So in the first year, each player will only have 6. But in subsequent years, your hand might contain more than 8 cards, which is your hand limit. So if after you've drawn your 6 cards that you're into your hand at the beginning of the year, you have more than 8 cards, then you have to discard down to 8 cards. At the beginning of year 1805, you'll have gone through your whole draw deck at that point. So you will shuffle your discard pile at the beginning of year 1805 and then draw 6 cards into your hand. And finally in 1806, the players will draw all the remaining cards in their discard pile and again discard down to 8. What that does is make sure that you have the opportunity to get all the cards that you need to get to the in-game scenarios, because for the American player there's a couple of cards required to win the game, and we'll talk about in-game or winning the game shortly. But anyway, at the beginning of year 1806, each player draws all the remaining cards in their discard pile and discards down to 8 cards. And it is possible that a game may not even make it to 1806. Not every game makes it through the end of year 1806. It could end earlier than that. So, after the start of year phase, where you've taken any frigates that are in the year that you're on, and you've drawn your 6 card and discarded down to 8. Now, I didn't mention the 3 core cards that each player has. Those don't count against your 8 hand limit. Those are always available until you play them. Each of these core cards, once you played, they're discarded permanently out of the game. In fact, they say that after playing as an event, this card is removed from the game. But again, back to after you've drawn your cards into your hand, discard down to 8. Then we go to the seasonal rounds, starting with spring. And each seasonal round, the American player will play a card, and then the Tripolitan player will play a card and do whatever the effects are, and then that will end the season, and you'll go to the next season, and again the American player will play, the Tripolitan player will play, Same thing through fall, winter. At the end of the winter, after the Tripolitan player plays, then that's the start of a new year. You'll move the marker back to spring, and that's when you move the marker to the next year and do the start of year phase where you'll draw cards and take any frigates that are on the track. So let's talk about what a player can do on their turn. So the first thing you can do is play a card for an event, which is its text. So again, as we talked about, these core cards have text. If you play them for their event, they are out of the game. Some of these cards, though, you can play for their event, and they just go into the discard pile. For instance, this one, move up to 4 American frigates and resolve any battles that result. So any of these cards that don't have an icon down here, if you play them for the event, they just go into your discard pile where they can eventually be drawn again. Some of them, like this one, that have this lightning bolt symbol, and it even says in text, if played as an event, this card is removed from the game. So if you play this for its event, you just discard it out of the game. It does not go into your draw pile. So that's one thing you can do, is play a card for an event. Okay, another option the American player has, instead of playing a card for an event, he can discard a card to move up to 2 frigates. So if he's not going to play the card for an event, he can discard it. It's not out of the game, it just goes into your discard pile. And then he can move up to 2 frigates that he has out on the board. So if the American player plays a card where he can move up to 2, as an action where he can move up to 2 frigates, frigates can be moved to, if they're moved to an empty harbor, they can be moved to any empty harbor with no additional action. They can be moved to any patrol zone, remember that's these light colors, with no additional action after that. If they are moved to a harbor where there are enemy ships, then there'll be a naval combat. And if they're moved to a harbor where there are enemy infantry, then there'll be a bombardment, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So again, an American player can play a card for its event. American player can play discard a card to move up to 2 frigates anywhere on the map they want to move them. And then the final thing the American player can do is discard a card to build a gunboat in Malta. And when they do that, they just take one of the U.S. gunboats and put it in Malta. And then that's the end of that action. There's only 3 U.S. gunboats, so the most you would ever do that is 3 times. Unless perhaps one of your gunboats gets destroyed in a naval combat, and then you might have one that would go back to the supply and you'd have it to build again. And you may notice in setup there are 2 Tripolitan Corsairs in Gibraltar. Gibraltar is the only place where the U.S. frigates and Tripolitan ships, Corsairs, will coexist peacefully. Any other time that frigates are moved and there are enemy ships in that harbor, there'll be a naval combat. But in Gibraltar, that's the only place where they coexist peacefully. So let's talk about the Tripolitan player. Again, they can play a card as an event. And again, if they play one of their core cards as an event, then it's removed from the game. If they play one of their cards with a lightning bolt as an event, then it's removed from a game. Now you may notice there's another card here that has a different icon, and that's a battle card. And those they're usually played when there's going to be a combat, and they state on the card when they can be played. So they may be played in reaction to a card that your opponent played that starts a battle, and then you may be able to play a battle card. It just depends on what the card is, but usually the battle card, once it's played, it's removed from the game also, and that's stated here at the bottom of the card. Alright, another thing the Tripolitan player can do is they can just discard any card from their hand into their discard pile to make a raid with the Corsairs from the Tripoli harbor. And we'll come back in a little bit and talk about how the raid works. But the final thing that a Tripolitan player can do is just discard a card from their hand into the discard pile to build a Corsair, if they have one available in the supply, in the Tripoli harbor. And that's the actions that they can take. So as we mentioned, the American player will play a card or discard a card to take an action, then the Tripolitan player will do the same thing. Then you move the marker to summer. Again, the American player will play, then the Tripolitan player, and so forth. Fall, winter, at the end of the winter, you advance to the next year, reset this to spring, and then we have the start of year phase, which we talked about, is when you'll draw new cards into your hand, discard down to 8, pick up any frigates. So let's get into more detail about what happens with a Corsair raid, how battles work, and how you win, how each side wins the game. So first, let's talk about the pirate raids. Now, pirate raids, as we mentioned, one of the actions that the Tripolitan player can do is discard a card to pirate raid with all the Corsairs in Tripoli. So when that happens, the Tripolitan player, if there's no American frigates or Swedish frigates in the patrol zone of Tripoli in this light colored, they just move their frigates to the open sea, and for each frigate, or not frigates, those are their Corsairs, for each Corsair, they get to roll 1 dice. And for any 5 or 6 that they roll, then they're successful on their raid, and they get to take 1 gold coin for each success. So they would take 1 gold coin from the American side of the board and put it in their area. And the successes and the gold coins that you get for the successes represent that the Corsairs have captured a merchant vessel and, taken goods or whatever. So they've gotten gold coins for that. Then those Corsairs just return to the harbor from whence they came. Now, if there are American or Swedish frigates in a patrol zone from where the Tripolitan player is going to raid, when they do their Corsair raid, first the frigates get a chance to attack the Corsairs before they get out to open sea. Now, the rules don't state move the Corsairs into the patrol zone. I like it just says you roll the dice, but I like to go ahead and move the Corsairs into the patrol zone. They're doing the action, they're performing a raid. First they'll move to the patrol zone. Then each frigate gets to roll 2 dice. So in this case, that would be 4 dice, two dice for each of the American frigates. So that'd be 4, and 2 dice for each of the Swedish frigates. So that would be another 4. So you roll all those. And any 6s are hits. So actually here we would get 1, 2, 3 hits. So 3 of those Corsairs would be sunk and moved into the Tripolitan supply, and only 1 would make it out into the open sea. Then that 1 would get to roll a dice, hoping for a 5 or 6. In this case, it's failure. And then he returns successfully to the harbor. There's no second attack when the Corsairs return to the harbor. All right, and so in that example, when they're doing a raid, if there are American and Swedish frigates in there, the Corsairs do not make any sort of attack roll against the American and Swedish frigates. Now, there are some battle cards that may be played that could affect things, but the uh, standard pirate raid is the pirates get attacked by any frigates in the patrol zone. Any surviving corsairs move on out to the open sea where they roll for their merchant ship attacks and see if they're successful. They get any gold for any successes and then return. And there can be pirate raids from some of these other harbors. The Tripolitan player has cards that they can play as event cards that will put some of these orange corsairs, which is their allies, so some Tunisian, Algerian, or Moroccan. They'll put some of those orange corsairs into these harbors, and then the Tripolitan player has cards that he can play, event cards he can play, that allow him to make raids, pirate raids from these other harbors as well. And it works the same thing if the American player has frigates in the patrol zone. They'll get a chance to attack those corsairs before they reach open sea and do their merchant ship attacks. But if there's no frigates in these patrol zones, then any corsairs that go out on their pirate raids just get to roll all their dice for each ship and come back safely to the harbor, similar to as if they were doing the pirate raid from Tripoli. But again, those are event cards that the Tripolitan player needs to play in order to get corsairs and do pirate raids from these allied locations. If the American player plays a card that allows him to, you know, move American frigates, or just discards an event card that allows him to move up to 2 frigates, and he moves them into a harbor that has enemy ships. For example, if he moved 2 frigates, again, other than Gibraltar, if he moved 2 frigates not into the patrol zone, but actually into the harbor of Tripoli that has enemy corsairs, then you would have a naval battle. And it works similarly to how when the frigates attacked the corsairs in the patrol zone, only in this case in a harbor, the corsairs would get to fight back. So in this case, if the American player discarded a card to move up to 2 ships and he moved him into the harbor of Tripoli, he would there would be a naval battle with these 4 corsairs here. So the American player would get to roll 2 dice for each of those frigates, so a total of 4. And again, any hits on a 6, so he would have got no hits. Then corsairs get to attack with 1 dice, so in this case there's 4 corsairs. The Tripolitan player would get to roll 4 dice, and again he only hits on 6s. So everybody missed. Now the battle does not continue once each player has rolled their die, and the combat is simultaneous. So even the attacking player would roll first, but it's simultaneous. So you would, if the American player had got some hits, you wouldn't remove the Tripolitan corsairs before they got to attack. Each player would get to roll for the amount of ships they have there and then take casualties. Now for each hit that the American player gets, a corsair can only take 1 hit. So for each hit, 1 corsair would have to be removed. However, frigates can take 2 hits, and the player that is taking the damage gets to decide how those are allocated. So if the Tripolitan player had rolled his 4 dice and he got 2 hits, the American player could decide to take both hits on 1 frigate, in which case one of his frigates would be sunk, and the Tripolitan player would take that frigate and put it in his play area, because one of their win conditions is to sink 4 American frigates. So if the American player assigned both hits to one frigate, then that frigate would be sunk and the Tripolitan player would take that. But he could assign one hit to each frigate. So when a frigate is damaged, if he assigned one hit to each frigate, the damaged frigates would just be put on the following year of the turn track, and then they can come back in when you reach the next year. But in the example that we showed, nobody got hit. After one round of the combat, then if the American player had moved in there, they had one round of the combat, nobody got any hits, the combat doesn't continue. Then any surviving American frigates or gunboats that took place in the battle would return to Malta. So let's take a quick minute to talk about the gunboats. You'll remember earlier, one of the actions I said the American player can take on their turn is to discard a card to their discard pile to build a gunboat in Malta. When you are playing a card that allows you to move your frigates, or discarding a card that allows you to move up to 2 frigates, if you are moving those frigates into a harbor where you're going to have a naval or land battle, at that point you move those frigates, but you can also move any gunboats that you have in Malta, and then they can take place in that battle as well. And just like a Corsair, a gunboat gets to roll 1 dice, and it only takes one hit to kill it. So, after the battle, any surviving frigates and gunboats would return to Malta. You can never just move a gunboat to attack. Again, whenever you're moving frigates to a location where you're going to attack, you can't move. If you're moving frigates into a patrol zone, you don't get to move a gunboat. A gunboat only gets to be moved if you're moving into an enemy harbor where you're going to have a naval battle or land battle. And then again, after the battle, in most cases, after one round, the surviving ships go back to Malta. Any destroyed ships go to the supply. And the other kind of battle you can have is a land battle. So if an American player played a card where he was moving his frigates maybe here into Dern, you would have, even though there's no ships, you would have a bombardment. And that works similarly to the naval battle, where each frigate would get to roll 2 dice, any gunboats would get to roll 1 dice. Any roll of 6 would remove 1 infantry from that city. After the one round of attack, any surviving American frigates or gunboats would go back to Malta. And in any of these naval battles or land battles, either player may have a battle card that may be able to be played, just depending on what it says. If the situation is met on the battle card that allows you to play it, then you can play it, and it will give you some possible benefit. So now let's talk about how the game is won. The Tripolitan player has 3 possible ways to win the game. If they acquire all 12 gold from merchant raids and tribute, if they manage to get all 12 gold at any point from the American side of the board, then they immediately win the game. The other way, as previously mentioned, if the Tripolitan player manages to sink 4 American frigates, as soon as the 4th American frigate is sunk, the Tripolitan player immediately wins the game. And the final way that the Tripolitan player can win is if they defeat Hamet's army. Now, the Tripolitan infantry will always be in Dern, Benghazi, and Tripoli, and we haven't talked about the American way to win, but one of their ways is to bring Hamet's army along with some U.S. Marines. They have cards that will allow them to start in Alexandria, and then they have to attack Dern, Benghazi, and finally Tripoli. And if they manage to do that successfully, then they win. But if Hamet's army is defeated before that happens, if all their army is defeated, then the Tripolitan player will win the game. So that's their three ways to win. So let's talk about the ways the United States or American player wins the game. Well, the American has two event cards that they can play, and if they meet the conditions on it, then they win the game. The first is by forcing a treaty, and you can see they can play this if it's in the fall of 1805 or later. So the 1 year marker would have to be in 1805, and it would have to be at least fall of 1805. So they can play it if that condition is met, and if the city of Algiers, Tangiers, and Tunis are at peace, meaning they have no enemy corsairs in their harbor, like it is at the beginning of the game. If there's no enemy corsairs in those orange harbors, then those are at peace. And if the city of Dern has been captured, again, that means you would have to have eliminated the infantry in Dern and had Hamet's army at least capture Dern. And if there are no Tripolitan frigates in the harbor of Tripoli. Again, there's some card events that can get some Tripolitan frigates into the harbor. But if there are no frigates in the harbor and all these events are met, then the American plays this card, then they'll win the game immediately. And the other way for the Americans to win is to play this Assault on Tripoli card, which is playable in the fall of 1805 or later, similar to the other card. Move all the American frigates and gunboats to the harbor of Tripoli, move Hamet's army from Benghazi to Tripoli. So you would have already, from previous play, you would have already had to taken Dern and Benghazi with Hamet's army before you could play this card, because once you play it, then you'll move all your frigates into the harbor and Hamet's army from Benghazi to Tripoli. And then you can play one of the battle cards you have is Send in the Marines and resolve the assault on Tripoli. So the assault on Tripoli works like this. So the first, we'll just say, the American plays the assault on Tripoli. The first thing you'll do is have naval combat. But unlike the other naval combat we talked about, where there's just one round of naval combat and any damaged frigates will go on the turn track of the next year, and any surviving ones will return to Malta. When you're doing the assault on Tripoli, you have the naval combat until there's no remaining ships. So if a frigate becomes damaged during the assault on Tripoli, you just turn it on its side. You can, if you allocate one hit to it and say it's damaged, you just turn it on its side. But if it then takes another hit, then it's eliminated. And if it's an American frigate, it goes to the Tripolitan player. So you'll continue to have rounds of combat until one side's navy is wiped out. If the American navy is wiped out, and the Tripolitan player managed to get 4 frigates, they'll win. If the Tripolitan player has wiped out, then you move on to the next phase, which is the ground combat. So if the American Navy wins the combat there in Tripoli on the assault on Tripoli, any frigates that were damaged and turned on their side. So any damaged American frigates would just be removed to the supply. Then any remaining frigates, American frigates and gunboats would get to make one bombardment against the Tripolitan army. Again, remember they would get to roll their dice. Any hits of 6 would remove one Tripolitan army. And then finally you'd go to the ground combat. And we haven't talked about ground combat yet, but it works the same as if the Hamet's army was attacking Dern or Benghazi. You get to roll, if the Hamet's army has moved into that city, or as we're talking about the assault on Tripoli, Hamet's army is moved into Tripoli. Each side rolls 1 dice for each unit they have on there. Any 6 is a hit, and after both sides have rolled, then you remove casualties. If there's still units remaining, you continue rolling again until there are no one side is wiped out. And if the American players played the assault on Tripoli and their ground forces win the ground combat, then they win the game. So that's the 2 ways for the Americans to win. Now, I didn't mention, but again, there could be some battle cards when you're doing the land combat, or for instance, the Tripolitan player has this battle card they can play during the naval battle in the harbor of Tripoli. So anyway, some battle cards can come into play for ground combat or naval combat. But those are the 2 ways the American player can win. So that's pretty much it. That's how the game is played. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. Let's go ahead and do a few example turns, and that should probably really hammer it in, and you'll see that it's not very difficult at all. Let's get started. Alright, I think I've got everything set back up how it should be right after setup. And then the start of year, so each side has drawn their 6 cards into their hand. It's the spring of 1801, so the American player will look at their cards and decide what they want to do. So I think what the American player is going to do is he's going to play this Swedish Frigates Arrive. It's one of his core cards. Place 2 Swedish frigates in the naval patrol zone of Tripoli. And then remember, this card is out of the game. It doesn't go into the discard pile. So that's how we get our 2 Swedish frigates into the patrol zone of Tripoli. Alright, that's the American player's turn for this season. So now we go to the Tripolitan player. So he's got these cards, but one of his core card is the Murad Rice breaks out. Move the 2 Tripolitan Corsairs from the harbor of Gibraltar. Remember, he's got 2 Tripolitan Corsairs up there. From the harbor of Gibraltar to the harbor of Tripoli, so he'll get to move them here. But any American frigates in the naval patrol zone of Gibraltar may first make an interception roll. However, there are frigates in the harbor, but there's none in the naval patrol zone. So he's going to play that. Again, that's a core card, so it's out of the game. And the interception roll is basically what I was talking about. If Corsairs move out to do a raid and you have ships in a patrol zone, then they get to make an attack on them first. But there were no American frigates in this patrol zone, so in this case, he just gets to move his Corsairs into the harbor of Tripoli. So now he's got 6 Corsairs in there. And that was the Tripolitan player's turn. So now we go to the summer season, and now we're back to the American player. Well, the American player is pretty sure this guy's going to try to make a pirate raid with those 6 Corsairs. And even though there's 2 Swedish frigates in there, he wants to get some more. So he's going to play this card, Naval Movement, move up to 4 American frigates, and resolve any battles that result. Well, because that one doesn't have an icon, it just goes into the discard player, or discard pile. He's got 3 frigates in Gibraltar. He's going to move every one of them. He's just going to move them into the patrol zone. If he moved them into the harbor, there would be a battle. But he's just going to move him into the patrol zone there, try to keep those guys bottled up. Alright, that was his turn, so now we're back to the Tripolitan player. We'll see what he wants to do. Alright, I think he's going to play the Philadelphia Runs Aground. Playable if there's at least one American frigate in the naval patrol zone of Tripoli. Well, there's 3. So he gets to roll a die and apply the results. So he's going to roll a die. Oh, Lord. Pitiful. He got a 1. Minor damage. Move an American frigate to the harbor of Malta. So that wasn't too helpful. He could have gotten where he sunk it, or he gets to capture it and you take the American frigate as sunk and place 1 Tripolitan frigate from the supply into the harbor of Tripoli. So that's one way you could have got a Tripolitan frigate on the board and into the harbor there. But sadly, he just got the one where just had to move the American frigate to Malta, and because this was a card, an event card with the thing, this one is now out of the game. Doesn't go into a discard pile. Alright, so that's the Tripolitan player's turn. So now we go to fall, and let's see what the American player wants to do. Really, none of the event cards he has will do him any good right now. And he can't play this core card to create Hamett's Army because it's not at least the spring of 1804. And this Thomas Jefferson card just lets him move 8 frigates. So what he's going to do, I think he's going to just discard. He's not going to play this card for an event. He's just going to discard this card to build a gunboat in Malta. So he takes a gunboat from the supply and puts it in Malta. So I was thinking the Tripolitan player may want to make a raid, pirate raid, discard a card to make a raid with his Corsairs. But there's, 4 frigates in there. I think what he's going to do first is play this Tripoli attacks event card. So he gets to move all the Tripolitan frigates and Corsairs from the harbor of Tripoli to the naval patrol zone of Tripoli. So that's all 6 of these. Then resolve a battle against the American frigates in the patrol zone. Any Swedish frigates in the patrol zone do not participate in the battle, so that's pretty good. Now this just goes into the discard pile. It doesn't have any icons or anything, so we'll put his discard pile here. So it's going to be a battle of these 6 Corsairs against these 2 American frigates. So he gets to roll 6 dice. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Any 6s are hits. And good Lord, not a single 6. Well, that's pitiful. He should have at least gotten 1 if you're going with the odds. But the Americans now get to roll with their frigates. They get 2 dice for each of their frigates, so a total of 4 dice. So 4. And they got 1 hit. So one of those Corsairs is killed and moved to the supply. And then these Corsairs will just return to the harbor of Tripoli. Alright, so that's the Tripolitan player's turn. Now we go to the winter of 1801 and back to the American player. And I think just to show a little something different, we're going to play this naval movement, move up to 4 American frigates and resolve any battles that occur. This is going to just go into the discard pile. So we're going to try to soften up Dern a little bit. So we get to move up to 4 American frigates. We're going to move these 2 from Tripoli, this one, and since we're going to be doing an attack, this gunboat gets to come also. So we're going to do a bombardment against the Dern. So we get to roll 6, 7 blue dice, hits on any 6. And we got a whole lot of 6s, so 4 6s. So that's going to kill all these guys here. And then these guys just move back to Malta after their bombardment. Okay, but now that does leave the Tripolitan Naval Patrol Zone a little bit weak. So the Tripolitan player says, he thinks he's just going to discard a card. He's going to discard a card to make remember, one of the actions he can do is discard a card to make a raid from Tripoli with all the Corsairs that are there. So since he didn't play this for the event, he's just it goes into the discard pile, and he's just well, this one would have gone into the discard pile even if you did play it for the event because it doesn't have an icon. But he's just playing it to do pirate raid. So he's going to pirate raid with all 5 of these Corsairs. So first the Swedish frigates get to make an interception roll, so they'll get to roll 2 dice for each of the frigates, so 4 dice. No 6s, so they've got no hits. So now these Corsairs move out into the open sea, and they each get to roll a dice, so that'll be a total of 5 dice. And they'll intercept and get some merchant ships if they get a 5 or 6. 1 5, so he gets 1 gold for 1 success. Now, if he had a card, which he doesn't, there's some that give you some bonuses if you have a successful raid. But now these Corsairs just get to move safely back into the harbor of Tripoli. Alright, well, that's the end of the year. So now we move the year marker. This frigate goes into the harbor of Gibraltar. We move this back to spring. Everybody draws 6 cards into their hand. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you have to discard down to 8. I believe that puts him at 9, so let me look at him and discard 1. Alright, that did give me a hand of 9, so I'm going to take this one, a Bainbridge Supplies Intel, and just discard that. So now I have a hand of 8. The Tripolitan player has to draw 6 cards. And that's going to give him a hand of 9, so let me see what he wants to discard. Alright, he did have 9, so he's just going to discard this Guns of Tripoli, and that's going to leave him with 8 cards. And now we start with the American player. So we'll do a couple more plays and then wrap it up. So it's the American player's turn. Alright, the American player is going to play Congress authorizes action. Place 2 American frigates on the following year of the turn track. And then this one goes out of the game. But he gets to take these 2 frigates from the supply and put them on the following year of the turn track. So when we get to 1803, that'll be 3 frigates that get to come out and go into Gibraltar. Alright, now it's the Tripolitan player's turn. He's going to play this one, Morocco Declares War, and he's going to place 3 Moroccan Corsairs in the harbor of Tangier. And then this card goes out of the game. So he gets to take 3 of these orange and put them in the harbor of Tangiers. Now that's additional, pirates that could possibly raid from over there. So the Americans may want to move some ships into the patrol zone. But that's their turn, so now we go to summer. So I think the American player is going to play this, move up to 4 American frigates. So he's going to move 1 frigate here to the harbor of Tangier. He'll move 2 frigates here into Tripoli. That's 3, as 1 more he can move. He'll move this one also over here to the harbor of Tangier. Kind of get those covered. Now again, you could move him into the harbors and actually have a battle, but he doesn't want to take the chance of losing any of his frigates, because if he loses 4, he loses the game. So, alright, that's what he's going to do. On to the Tripolitan player. Alright, he's going to play this one. Tunis declares war and place 3 Tunisian Corsairs in the harbor of Tunis. This one goes out of the game. And he gets 3 Corsairs that go into the harbor of Tunis. Now that's another area that the Americans are going to have to try to cover. But that's the Tripolitan's turn, so now we move on to fall. We'll finish this year up and then call it. So the Americans' turn. I think the Americans are just going to not play this card for the event. They're just going to discard it to build another gunboat in Malta. And now we go to the Tunisian turn. And I think the Tripolitan player is going to play the old Youssef Karamali core card. Pirate raid with the Corsairs from the harbor of Tripoli and the Corsairs from the harbor of each active ally. So you get to pirate raid with these guys, and these guys. And of course that's a core card, so it goes out of the game. So we'll just start with these guys. So first American frigates get to make an interception roll, so they get to roll 4 dice because they got 2 frigates there. And they got no hits. So these Corsairs move out to the open sea. They each get to roll a dice. And unfortunately they didn't get any merchant ships, so they just return safely. These ones get to move out to open sea. There's nobody to intercept them, so they just roll 3. And, oh my god, terrible rolls. Alright, well, he doesn't get anything either. Now these 5 Corsairs do get intercepted by these Swedish and American frigates, so that's going to be a total of 8 dice, 4 for the Americans and 4 for the Swedish. 2 sixes, so 2 of these Corsairs are hit and move to the supply, but 3 do go out to the open sea. And let's get these dice out of here. So they get to roll 3 dice. And nothing. Gosh, terrible. Well, that's pitiful for the Tripolitan player. I thought he was going to get a good amount of gold. If he had been pretty successful there, he could have been halfway to his winnings if he had got quite a bit of gold there. But that's his turn. We move to winter. Most of the Americans' event cards are not really going to do him much good until later in the game. So again, we'll just play his assault on Tripoli. He'll discard that. I mean, he can't play it for the event yet, but he can discard it to build another gunboat. Remember, he'll have the chance to get that back in his hand later in the game. So for the Tripolitan's final turn of 1802, let's see what he's going to do. He'll just play the Tripoli acquires Corsairs, place 2 Tripolitan Corsairs in the harbor of Tripoli. Again, this one goes out of the game when played, not into the... so he puts those 2 Corsairs in there. That's the end of the year, so we would go to 1803. All 3 of these frigates would go to Gibraltar. This goes back to spring, and we would draw 6 more cards into our hand and discard down to 8, and so would the Tripolitan player, and so forth. And eventually, once we get over to where we could play, some of these other that create Hamet's army. Oh yeah, so in the spring of 1804, so next year, at the beginning of next year, we could create Hamet's army if there's a frigate. So we would have to move a frigate to Alexandria, and then we could place 1 Marine and 5 Arab infantry units in the city of Alexandria. These are the Arab infantry units, these are the Marine units. So we would get to place those in Alexandria, and that would be Hamet's army. There are other cards that let you acquire more army units. And then they could begin their move into Dern and into Benghazi, and then hopefully we would get to play the Assault on Tripoli card. And of course, meantime, the Tripolitan player has cards that allow him to put more units in Benghazi and Dern and Tripoli, and also hopefully make some more successful pirate raids so he could get some gold. But you can see how the game plays. We're almost halfway done, and that was pretty quick, just showing you that. I really enjoy this game. I mean, I haven't got to play it with another real player yet. I've just played it myself. Again, as I said, playing as two players like I'm doing here, and I tried the solo mode one time. The two times I played it by myself, the American player won, and when I tried it with the solo mode, the Tripolitan player won. But I think I the first few turns I was doing something wrong with the solo mode. There's a few, uh, there's it plays a little differently. The Tripolitan player gets a row of cards, and in the solo mode, and he plays those if their event is possible, he'll play that, and you just go down the row of cards until you get to the one you can possibly do. But anyway, I really like this game. I had fun playing it. I'd like to play it against another real player, but it's quick. The rules are simple, and it's fun. So that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.